Saturday afternoon, the sky over Spokane was clear. By Saturday night, it was gone, swallowed whole by a wall of orange that no one in the city had ever seen before. Not like this, not this close, not this fast. There was no siren long enough, no alert loud enough, to prepare 250,000 people for what was about to happen to their city in the space of a single night. Spokane is not a place that expects to burn. It sits in the inland Pacific Northwest, ringed by pine forest and farmland, a city of coffee shops and university students and quiet residential streets that had, for generations, watched wildfire season unfold somewhere else. On television, in headlines about California or Eastern Oregon, always distant, always someone else's disaster. That distance collapsed in a matter of hours. It began on the West Plains, in the dry grass and scattered pine near Airway Heights, a place most residents of Spokane could not have pointed to on a map 24 hours earlier. Within hours, it had a name. Within a day, it had 3 names. And within 72 hours, it had become one of the most destructive urban wildfire disasters in the history of the Pacific Northwest. This is the story of the Spokane Complex Fires, the Old Trails Fire, the Fairview Fire, and a third blaze that together tore through neighborhoods, jumped a river, and forced tens of thousands of people to leave everything behind in the middle of the night. And as of this moment, the fires are still not fully contained. Crews are still out there, and no one can say with certainty how this ends. Officials would later refer to what happened as one of the fastest-moving urban interface fire disasters the state has ever recorded, a phrase that sounds almost clinical until you understand what it actually means. A fire that behaves less like the slow, grinding forest blazes of wildfire documentaries, and more like a flash flood, arriving with almost no warning, moving through developed neighborhoods at a pace that outran official evacuation notices in more than one case, and leaving behind a level of destruction that took less time to create than it will take to describe. To understand how a grass fire on the outskirts of a mid-sized American city turned into a catastrophe of this scale, you have to go back further than Saturday. You have to go back to last winter, a winter that barely happened. Washington State, like much of the American West, depends on snowpack the way a body depends on a heartbeat it never has to think about. Snow falls in the mountains through the winter, sits there quietly, and then releases its water slowly through spring and into summer, feeding rivers, keeping forests hydrated, keeping the land from turning into fuel. In 2026, that heartbeat faltered. A historic snow drought left mountain snowpack far below normal, and an unusually warm winter meant what little snow did fall melted early. By the time summer arrived, the forests and grasslands around Spokane had already been drying out for weeks longer than they should have. Trees under prolonged water stress do something almost invisible to the naked eye. They become kindling standing upright. Grasslands that should still hold some moisture in early August instead crackle underfoot. And Spokane sits in one of the most dangerous configurations a modern American city can occupy. The wildland-urban interface where subdivisions and cul-de-sacs and backyard fences push directly up against dry forest and open grassland, with no meaningful buffer between a spark and a rooftop. All that was missing was ignition. And on Saturday, August 1st, ignition came. Fire behavior specialists have a term for the kind of landscape Spokane had become by late July. A fuel bed primed to carry flame faster than crews can physically respond to it. Cured grass burns at a rate that outpaces a person walking briskly. Add wind, and it outpaces a person running. What made this particular fire so dangerous wasn't just the dryness of the land. It was the specific, unlucky alignment of drought, wind, and geography, all converging on the exact same afternoon, over the exact same stretch of terrain that happens to sit right where suburban Spokane meets open grassland. Fire scientists sometimes call this kind of setup a worst-case alignment. Spokane got the worst case. Investigators have not released a full account of how each fire started, but one thing is now confirmed. A man has been arrested and charged with arson in connection with the Old Trails Fire, one of the 3 blazes that make up the Spokane complex. Whether that single act was the spark for the entire disaster, or one ignition among several converging at the worst possible moment, is still being pieced together. What is not in question is what happened next. Winds gusting between 35 and 45 miles an hour swept across the West Plains that afternoon. In dry conditions like these, wind does not just fan a fire, it launches it. Embers can travel far ahead of the main fire line, landing on roofs, in gutters, and dry grass a quarter-mile away, starting new fires before firefighters even know the front has moved. Meteorologists and fire behavior experts watching radar that evening described what they were seeing in real time as a major wildfire disaster unfolding, live, over a city of nearly 250,000 people. By early evening, the fire that would become known as the Old Trails Fire had grown to roughly 3,000 acres. That number alone would have made it a serious story on any other day. But this was not any other day. This was a day when the wind would not stop, and the fire had somewhere else to go. It went into Riverside State Park, And then it did something that turned a bad wildfire into a historic one. It crossed the Spokane River. Rivers are supposed to be natural fire breaks. Water does not burn. But wind-driven wildfires do not respect the logic of geography the way people assume they should. Embers rode the gusts across the water, landed on the far bank, and ignited new fires on the other side. What had been a wildland fire on the edge of the city was now a fire inside the city. It reached the Indian Trail neighborhood in North Spokane sometime that night. Residents who had gone to bed under a hazy but manageable sky woke, or in many cases never went to sleep at all, to a scene that longtime locals would later describe as apocalyptic. Home after home along West Euclid Road and the surrounding streets caught fire in sequence, the flames leaping from structure to structure, propelled by wind and by the simple, brutal physics of one burning house being enough to ignite the house 11 feet away. Loud explosions echoed through the smoke. Propane tanks, vehicle fuel lines, transformers, the mechanical innards of suburban American life detonating one after another in the dark. Residents spoke of carrying pets out with burned paws, of neighbors banging on doors to wake families who had no idea the fire had already crossed the river, of driving through smoke so thick that streetlights disappeared 20 feet away. One resident, describing the scene after escaping with her dog, put it simply, "When the sun rises, this city is going to be in shock." She was right. By Sunday morning, the scale of what had happened overnight was becoming clear, and it kept getting worse through the day. Local journalists who had covered Spokane for decades described it, without exaggeration, as one of the worst natural disasters the city had ever recorded. Reporters and photographers moved through neighborhoods that morning, documenting scenes that felt less like a Pacific Northwest suburb and more like a war zone. Chimneys standing alone where houses used to be, melted street signs, cars reduced to blackened metal skeletons in driveways where families had planned to load them just hours earlier and simply ran out of time. Before and after, satellite imagery of streets like West Pine Cliff Court and West Weil Avenue captured the transformation in a single frame. Green lawns and rooftops on one side, ash and rubble on the other, separated by nothing more than 72 hours. In some of those images, a single house stands untouched in the middle of a block of destruction. A firefighter caught mid-motion, hose in hand, spraying down the walls and roof of that one surviving structure, while the house next to it burns to the studs. It is the kind of photograph that becomes almost instantly the defining image of a disaster, proof of both the devastation and the exhausted, relentless effort of the crews trying to hold a line against something moving faster than they could. Washington Governor Bob Ferguson declared a state of emergency as the fires continued to spread, citing not only the fast-moving flames, but the extremely poor air quality now blanketing much of the Pacific Northwest. Smoke from the Spokane complex fires didn't stay in Spokane. It rode the same winds that had driven the flames, pushing into surrounding counties, degrading air quality across the region to levels considered unhealthy, with fine particulate matter, the PM2. 5 that lodges deep in human lungs, spiking well past safe thresholds. Emergency management officials began urging residents, even those not in immediate evacuation zones, to wear N95, NISH, or 100 masks if they had to go outside, and to avoid any contact with ash or debris near damaged homes, warning that fire debris carries chemical residues that can be dangerous to touch or breathe. Evacuation orders expanded rapidly. What began as targeted, block-by-block warnings became a sweeping mobilization. At the peak of the crisis, roughly 60,000 people were under evacuation orders. Across Spokane and neighboring Stevens County, 60,000 people told with little notice to gather what they could and leave, not knowing if their homes would still be standing when they were allowed to return. By the time officials had a clearer picture of the damage, the numbers were staggering for a fire event of this kind. More than 600 structures destroyed. More than 5,000 acres burned in the initial assessment, a figure that would climb dramatically in the following days as 3 separate fires continued to spread and merge into what authorities now refer to collectively as the Spokane-area fires, or the Spokane complex. And then came the number that made even seasoned emergency responders pause: 14 people unaccounted for. In the chaos of a fast-moving nighttime wind-driven fire that crossed a river and tore through a residential neighborhood. In a matter of hours, tracking every single person becomes almost impossible in real time. Families get separated. Cell service goes down. People evacuate to different shelters, different relatives' homes, different cities entirely, without anyone officially logging where they went. For days, 14 names sat on a list that no one wanted to think too hard about. A quiet undercurrent of dread running beneath every official briefing. Emergency officials, aware of how those 14 names were being read online, shared, speculated about, turned into open questions on social media by people far from Spokane who had never set foot in Indian Trail, tried to be careful with their language. Unaccounted for, they repeated, again and again, is not the same as missing, and missing is not the same as lost. It is, more often than not, a communication gap in the middle of chaos. A grandmother who evacuated to her daughter's house in Coeur d'Alene without telling the county, a college student who drove to a friend's dorm and didn't think to check in. But no official could promise that outcome in advance. And for 4 days, 14 families sat with a version of uncertainty that has no comfortable place to put itself. Search and rescue teams, along with the Spokane County Sheriff's Office, worked through the wreckage and through evacuation records, cross-referencing names, making calls, checking shelters. And on Tuesday, August 4th, the update came that the entire region had been waiting for. All 14 people previously listed as unaccounted for were confirmed safe. It was, by any measure, the best possible outcome to the worst possible number. But it did not undo the 600 homes. It did not undo the neighborhoods that no longer exist in the form they did 4 days earlier. And it did not mean the fires were out. This is not the first time Spokane County has lived through a disaster like this, though it may be the worst. Locals with long memories point back to 2023, when the Gray Fire burned through the community of Medical Lake, destroying roughly 240 structures and killing one person over the course of several weeks. At the time, it was described as one of the most destructive wildfires in the county's history. That record did not survive 3 years. The Spokane Complex fires of 2026 have already surpassed it, and structures lost. And they did it not over weeks, but over a single catastrophic weekend. A compression of destruction that has left even veteran emergency officials struggling to find the right words for briefings that update by the hour. As of the most recent updates, the Spokane fires had burned more than 10,000 acres, over 16 square miles, a stretch of scorched earth larger than many American towns, and crews were still actively battling the flames. Some evacuation zones have been downgraded, moved from level 3, go now orders down to level 2, be set, or level 1, get ready status, a sign of cautious progress. But officials have been careful, almost insistent in their messaging. Downgraded does not mean safe. Residents returning to previously evacuated areas have been warned repeatedly not to assume their homes are livable, not to enter structures until fire officials clear them, and not to touch ash or debris without protection. The human infrastructure required to support 60,000 displaced people has been staggering in its own right. The Spokane Convention Center, normally host to trade shows and conferences, has been converted into a full evacuation shelter, its floors lined with cots instead of booths. The Spokane County Fair and Expo Center has taken on a different but equally urgent role. As of the latest count, it was sheltering 198 displaced animals, dogs and cats and livestock pulled from the path of the fire alongside their owners, because for many evacuees, leaving a pet behind was never an option, no matter how fast the flames were moving. Some evacuees, with nowhere else to go, have been staying in RVs and trailers hooked up at the Northern Quest Resort and Casino, a strange and telling image of modern disaster response, a casino parking lot repurposed overnight into a small displaced city. Behind all of this sits a wider, more unsettling pattern that most people, watching the Spokane footage on their phones, have no idea they're a part of. This is not an isolated event. As of early August 2026, more than 44,000 wildfires had already burned over 5 million acres across the United States this year, a figure well above the 10-year average for this point in the fire season. Crews were simultaneously stretched thin battling major fires in Oregon, ignited by a wave of lightning storms in the preceding weeks, and additional large fires burning along the Utah-Colorado border. Spokane was not burning in isolation. It was one bright, catastrophic point on a national map already lit up with red. That context matters, because it changes the question from why did this happen to Spokane to a harder one. Why is this kind of event becoming the pattern, not the exception? Climate scientists and fire behavior analysts point to the same converging factors again and again. Historically low snowpack, warmer winters that fail to replenish groundwater and vegetation moisture, longer and more intense dry seasons, and continued residential development pushing deeper into the wildland-urban interface, placing more homes than ever directly in the path of fires that used to burn through empty forest and nothing else. Spokane didn't do anything uniquely wrong. It simply sat exactly where the compounding pressures of a changing climate and expanding suburban development were guaranteed to meet, sooner or later. It is worth sitting with that number for a moment. 5 million acres burned nationally by early August, with the fire season nowhere near finished. To put it in perspective, that is an area larger than the entire state of New Jersey, already reduced to ash or actively burning before the calendar even turns to the traditionally worst months of the western fire season. Firefighting agencies across the country are operating under a strain that didn't exist a generation ago. Stretched thin, moving crews, an aircraft from one emergency to the next, borrowing resources across state lines, and increasingly relying on mutual aid agreements that assume disasters will be staggered rather than simultaneous. This year, that assumption has been tested again and again. Oregon's lightning-sparked fires, the blazes along the Utah-Colorado border, and now Spokane are all drawing from the same finite, exhausted pool of engines, air tankers, and personnel. That scarcity has real consequences on the ground in Spokane. Every additional crew, every additional air tanker sent to hold a line here is a crew and a tanker that isn't available somewhere else, and vice versa. Fire commanders have spoken candidly about the difficulty of requesting reinforcements in a season when nearly every region of the American West is asking for the same thing at the same time. It is a quiet, unglamorous part of the disaster that rarely makes the headline footage, not the flames themselves, but the logistics war being fought behind them, over which fire gets the next available strike team. For the people living through it, none of that context softens the reality on the ground. It doesn't rebuild the 600 structures. It doesn't answer the question every displaced family is now asking, standing in a shelter or a relative's spare room, staring at their phone for updates. Is there anything left to go back to? Some will find their homes standing, untouched by some quirk of wind direction or a fire break that held. Others will return to nothing but a concrete foundation and the blackened outline of a life that existed 4 days ago. That randomness, the fire that takes one house and spares the one next to it, is one of the cruelest and most well-documented features of urban wildland fires, and Spokane residents are only beginning to discover which category their address falls into. For those whose homes did survive, there's a different, quieter kind of dread waiting for them. Air quality warnings that make it dangerous to simply walk through their own front yard, ash that may carry traces of burned insulation, plastics, and vehicle components, and instructions from health officials to avoid direct skin contact or inhalation until testing can confirm what, exactly, settled onto their property while they were gone. Recovery, for thousands of households, will not begin with rebuilding. It will begin with a hazardous materials assessment. The economic toll is only beginning to take shape, but early comparisons to past Pacific Northwest wildfire disasters suggest the number will run into the tens of millions of dollars at minimum, likely far higher once insurance assessments are complete, covering not just structures, but vehicles, infrastructure, utility lines, and the broader cost of housing 60,000 displaced residents for however many weeks it takes before evacuation orders are fully lifted. Insurance adjusters are expected to descend on the region within days, beginning a process that, for many families, will stretch out far longer than the fire itself ever burned. There is also the question of what comes back and what doesn't. Wildfires of this scale don't just destroy structures, they reshape the ecological baseline of the land itself for years afterward. Burned soil loses its ability to absorb water efficiently, which means the same hillsides now stripped of vegetation around Spokane will carry a heightened risk of flash flooding and mudslides the moment meaningful rain finally does arrive, turning a fire disaster into a potential water disaster months down the line, a pattern seen after nearly every major wildland urban fire in the American West over the past decade. Emergency planners are already, even now, beginning to model that secondary risk, aware that the danger from this event will not end when the last flame is extinguished. Recovery, when it comes, will not be measured in days. Insurance claims, debris removal, air quality monitoring, soil and water testing near burn scars, rebuilding permits, mental health support for a population that just watched their neighborhood burn in real time. All of it stretches out over months, sometimes years, long after the news cameras and the trending hashtags have moved on to the next disaster. Washington's state agencies have already begun setting up longer-term resource pages, disaster food benefit replacement programs, and veteran and family support services, a quiet acknowledgement that this is not a one-week story, no matter how it's being covered right now. Search and rescue units, alongside utility crews from Avista and other regional providers, have been working in tandem through the burn zones. One team clearing debris and checking for remaining hotspots, the other assessing downed power lines and damaged infrastructure that pose their own risk of reignition even after the visible flame front has passed. Dead trees weakened by fire continue to fall for days and sometimes weeks afterward, an underappreciated danger that keeps crews and returning residents alike on edge, even in areas officially cleared of active fire. As of this update, the fires are still burning. Containment lines are still being drawn and redrawn. Evacuation zones are shifting hour by hour, some opening, some staying locked down as wind forecasts change. The official death toll, remarkably, still stands at what officials are calling a near miracle for a fire of this speed and scale. But the full accounting of a loss in homes and belongings and a sense of safety that an entire city used to take for granted is still being written. Crews on the ground are exhausted. Some have been rotating through shifts for 4 straight days, sleeping in fire camps, breathing smoke that health officials openly admit is unhealthy even for trained responders. Reinforcements have been called in from across the state and beyond, but with dozens of major fires burning simultaneously across the American West this season, resources that Spokane needs are the same resources being fought over by Oregon, by Utah, by Colorado. No rain is currently in the forecast. Winds, while expected to ease somewhat compared to Saturday's catastrophic gusts, remain unpredictable enough that officials are refusing to give any timeline for full containment. Every briefing ends the same way it began, with a warning that conditions can change quickly, that residents should stay alert, that this is not over. Meanwhile, the political response is beginning to take its own shape. Governor Ferguson's emergency declaration unlocks state resources and clears the way for federal disaster assistance requests, a process that Washington officials have indicated they intend to pursue aggressively given the scale of destruction. Congressional representatives for the district have begun issuing statements pledging support, and questions are already surfacing about longer-term policy, about defensible space requirements for homes built at the edge of wildland, about whether insurance markets in fire-prone parts of the Pacific Northwest can remain viable if events like this become annual rather than generational, and about whether a city like Spokane, which never saw itself as a wildfire city, will now have to rebuild its entire relationship with the landscape around it. None of those conversations will be resolved this week or this month. They rarely are. What tends to happen, disaster after disaster, region after region, is that the immediate crisis dominates every headline for a matter of days. The emergency shelters slowly empty as people find longer-term housing, and then the deeper structural questions quietly recede from public attention long before they're actually answered. Whether Spokane follows that same pattern, or whether the scale of this particular event forces something different, is itself part of the uncertainty hanging over the city right now. Inside the Spokane Convention Center, the rhythm of shelter life has settled into something both orderly and quietly heartbreaking. Volunteers moving between rows of cots, handing out water and snacks. Children who don't fully understand why they can't go home, drawing pictures on donated notepads. Elderly evacuees sitting near phone charging stations, trying to reach relatives. Caseworkers moving from family to family with clipboards, trying to match displaced people with the resources they now unexpectedly need. Food replacement benefits, temporary housing assistance, help replacing identification documents that burned along with everything else. Every one of those quiet transactions represents a life that was, 5 days ago, entirely ordinary. At the Fair and Expo Center, the sound is different. Barking, the occasional distressed bray of livestock, the low hum of generators keeping temporary kennels cool in August heat. Volunteers there have described a steady stream of owners arriving, not to drop off animals, but simply to sit with them for a few minutes, to prove to themselves and to their pets that some part of their old life is still intact, still breathing, still recognizable, amid everything else that isn't. Somewhere in Spokane tonight, a family that spent decades building a life in a house on West Euclid Road, or somewhere like it, is sitting in a shelter cot, watching the news for updates, waiting to find out if there's anything left to go home to. Somewhere else, a firefighter who hasn't slept properly in 4 days is climbing back into a truck for another shift, heading toward a fire line that keeps moving because the wind keeps changing. And somewhere above all of it, the smoke is still rising, carried by wind that no one controls, over a city that is still counting what it has lost and still, even now, waiting to find out how much more there is left to lose.